Thank you to everyone for joining us today for this Lunch and Learn webinar, where we will discuss what Save the Sound is doing to protect your clean air and fight climate change with our climate and energy attorney, Charles Rothenberger. So for those who may be less familiar with Save the Sound, we're a nonprofit leading environmental action in the Long Island Sound region. We fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the sound and its rivers, and work with nature to restore ecosystems. And it's because of our supporters and members that we're able to continue fighting crucial environmental battles and provide informative webinars like this one. And if you would like to help us keep fighting in your backyard in the year ahead, we'd really appreciate any support. You can go to savethesound.org/donate and make a gift to your regional environment. And that's my quick pitch. And now I have some housekeeping to let you know that we are recording this. So I'm going to ask that everyone please stay muted for the duration of the webinar. We're going to hear from Charles first and then open up for Q&A at the end. And as we go along, you can feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat box and I will read them out loud at the end.
As Emily said, my name is Charles Rothenberger. I work as the climate and energy attorney for Save the Sound. The focus of today will really be on what's happening at the General Assembly with respect to climate legislation. We will almost certainly not touch on every bill that has been introduced. There are a lot of bills that have been introduced and perhaps not even every one that's moving through the session as we sort of spend our time to highlight a few of the higher priority bills, but happy to discuss any of the legislation that may be on your radar as well during the Q&A. So I think with that, we can turn to the next slide. And thank you, Emily, for agreeing to be the slide keeper. So I guess part of the news is that we actually have a legislative session this year, right? Some of you may remember that just as we were starting the public hearing process last year, COVID struck in Connecticut. While we thought we might be back in session before the adjournment date last year, that never happened. So there's really a lot of unfinished business on the agenda this year. And many of the bills may sound familiar if you followed what was happening last year as they've been reintroduced by various parties. Just to sort of give some context. So this is our long session in an odd numbered year where we have elections and a lot of new legislators. So the General Assembly convened on January 6th of this year, and they will be adjourning, God willing, on June 9th. So hopefully we'll get a full session in. Right now we're right in the middle of the public hearing process. There's actually a very lengthy energy and technology public hearing going on right now. And we'll be talking about some of the bills that they are hearing testimony on. But just wanted to share a few deadlines, and those are the deadlines that the relevant committees for our purposes have with respect to reporting bills out. So they're hearing testimony on bills now. Following testimony, they'll reconvene. The committee members will talk about the bills, and they will take a vote either to move the bill to the floor of the House or Senate, or perhaps another committee, or to do so with amendments, and that's called a substitute language. So they can change the bills based upon the testimony that they hear and discussions among themselves. And even though we're back in session, it's an all virtual session. And I think there's still a little bit of growing pains that the legislature is experiencing with respect to that. For the most part, they figured out the technology. But for instance, there was a hearing yesterday where they spent what felt like an eternity trying to connect one of their committee members in the middle of someone else's testimony. So there are still a few hiccups in the process, but the good news is that bills are being heard. They are moving through the committee process. So we're all learning to do this virtually, but I think we're starting to get the hang of it. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. And this, again, sort of sets the context for what we're talking about. So Connecticut does have a Global Warming Solutions Act, which mandates particular greenhouse gas reductions. And as part of that, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection has to produce an inventory each year to let us know where we are. And the eagle-eyed among you will notice that my slide says 2017. Because of the data collection and analysis that's required, the inventory runs about 3 years behind. So the most recent information we have is 2017. If you look at sort of that nice circle on the right, you can see by far the transportation sector is one of our biggest challenges when it comes to taking action moving forward. But still have some fairly significant work to do in the electricity sector, as well as in the building sector, which probably presents the greatest challenges, just because of the age of our housing stock in terms of increasing energy efficiency, the fact that we have a lot of heating oil heated buildings, as well as natural gas in a lot of our big cities. So transitioning those to cleaner alternative fuels is a challenge, but one that the state is definitely digging into, which we'll also talk about as we dive into the legislation. Next slide. And this sort of shows you where the state is with respect to emissions up to 2017. The left side of that chart is sort of our 1990 target. The right side of it is more or less where we need to be this year. So it'll be a couple years before we know if we hit that target. That's a 10% below 2000 or 10% below 1990 levels. We're on target, but things can happen. I think COVID, although it's it was terrible, did help us with our emissions, certainly in the short term, as fewer people were driving and on the roads. But that's obviously not a permanent or a perfect solution. But so far so good, at least for our short-term target. We do appear to be right about where we need to be. But if you look at that line, you can see it wasn't really a very ambitious target, right? It's basically flat, just a little bit below. And if we go to the next slide, I think this really underscores the enormity of the challenge that we have. Oh, I think back up one. There we go. So where we left off on the last chart is just about where the slope of the line really takes a nosedive on the right of that chart. So you can see that 10% below 1990, we're pretty much right on target, as I said, but the 45% below 2001 by 2030 that we need to hit is that second dot on the right, and then the 80% below 2001 is the far side of that chart. So you can see the magnitude of the emissions reductions we're going to have to achieve are much greater over a much shorter period of time, and I think compounded by the fact that in some respects we've done the easy work. So we really do have to address the transportation sector. We really do have to address the building sector. And with respect to the electricity sector, we have several very good programs in place to transition us to clean and renewable energy. Certainly more needs to be done. But Governor Lamont certainly is attempting to move that agenda a little bit. That red line at the bottom of the chart represents his zero carbon goal by 2040. So certainly for the supply side of the equation, that will help enormously in terms of bringing down the curve. But I just share that chart to show, we've done the easy stuff, and it's really now time to tackle the bigger challenges moving forward. Thank you. Next slide. And so that sort of gets us into what's happening up at the Connecticut General Assembly. So there are a number of bills addressing climate change and climate emissions across a number of sectors. Start with the electricity sector, just because one of the signature bills of the governor's administration is SB 882. which does a number of things, and it's kind of a combination of a couple of bills from last session. I think the marquee element of this bill is that it would codify the governor's executive order, which called for zero carbon electric supply by 2040. Also included in the bill is authorization for DEEP to procure a significant amount of electricity from demand response and energy efficiency programs, very critical, particularly for our building sectors. Reducing energy demand is a great way to sort of help variable renewable energy sources sort of fill that gap. If we reduce demand, we can do the same amount with less. And then finally, and this is an item that Save the Sound has been working on for a number of years, it would require the disclosure of residential property energy performance, basically. And there'd be two ways to go about that. There's a HERS score, basically an energy rating score for residential buildings. So property owners could go through the process to have a certified energy score, which they could share with potential purchasers or renters. Or there'd be a requirement for the utilities to provide sort of aggregated, non-identifiable bill information related to the energy usage of a particular building or a particular unit. And it's really a way of, one, empowering consumers to make informed choices when it comes to, what their energy burden might be in a new situation. And also to be competitive encourages homeowners to maybe invest in some energy efficiency improvements as well. So I see, as we're talking about this, one question about demand response. Probably a good time to talk about that. So demand response, it can take a number of forms, but essentially what we're talking about is our utility programs where the utility will give or will contact, could be residential customers, could be businesses or commercial customers that they're experiencing a peak draw on the electricity grid, and individuals who have signed up ahead of time can then voluntarily reduce their energy usage or shift their energy usage in exchange for some compensation from the utility, as it helps to sort of lower the energy burden during those peak times. It's something that can be done in real time and is really helped quite a bit by advancements in utility meter infrastructure. You sometimes hear talked about smart meters, and smart meters are certainly one of the things that makes demand response programs a lot easier to implement. And as we think about, increases in the deployment of battery storage, that is also going to be a technology element that plays into that a great deal, but a great question. So the other bills we have here, so we have a sort of a broad solar bill in SB 952. Speaking of energy storage, this would actually establish some energy storage goals for the state for the first time as battery storage becomes more available. It increases the state's current cap on virtual net metering, and I will define that. So virtual net metering is a program that the state has where certain classes of customers, whether they're a municipality or a agricultural site host or the state, they can actually engage. They can procure renewable energy resources in excess of what any particular building might use, and then they can assign the additional energy storage, or not energy storage, energy generation from that oversized system to other so-called beneficial accounts that are connected to them. So if you're a municipality, you put a solar installation on the roof of your building, or maybe in the parking lot, it's producing more than town hall can use. You can actually use that excess generation to offset some of the bills And so it's been a very popular program. It's usually or always oversubscribed. So this would expand the cap from $20 million to $30 million. There are some caveats to that, so we're working through the details, but generally any increase in the cap of that program is desirable. And then it would also, perhaps most controversially, provide for limited ownership of solar power generation facilities by the electric distribution companies. And again, very, very prescribed, 150 megawatts. 50% of it would need to be in distressed communities, but sort of trying to expand those programs. And there's previously the utilities, there's also been legislation to allow them to own battery storage as well. So sort of dipping their toes into the renewable energy world as owners of generation rather than just the distribution utility. 6523, again, it's a second bill on virtual net metering, which would bring in municipalities as an eligible entity. Same deal, raises the cap from $20 to $30 million. So imagine those bills, if the concepts move forward, will be combined in one omnibus piece of legislation. And then finally, 6527, which so the state has a renewable portfolio standard, which requires the electric utilities to procure certain percentages of their delivered resources from renewable energy. And it's defined as either class 1, which you typically think solar, wind, and a few other categories. Class 2, which is very problematic trash to energy facilities, which in Connecticut are defined as renewable. And then the class 3, again, involves several categories, but energy efficiency and demand response programs fall within that class 3 program. So again, increasing those requirements. Moving on to the transportation sector. Again, another marquee bill of the administration is 884, reducing transportation-related carbon emissions. You've probably heard or read in the news about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. This is a program that builds on a very successful program for the electricity sector called RGGI, which is both of these are and would be regional programs which establish declining caps on the carbon emissions associated with their particular fuel. In the case of RGGI, it applies to the electric generators. In the case of TCI, it would apply to on-road diesel and gasoline fuel. So wholesalers and importers bringing that fuel into the states that participate would need to purchase carbon allowances. And one allowance is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's a way both of establishing a declining cap, which guarantees reductions in climate pollution from these fuels, and also secondarily produces a revenue stream through the auctioning of the allowances, which can then be reinvested in additional clean transportation initiatives. So it's really doubling the bang for your buck. And there's 13 states participating in the design of this program. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and DC are the first ones to commit to implementing it. So this bill would provide the necessary authorization to draft regulations and begin the program, which will really start in 2023. So there's a couple-year ramp-up period to make sure that all of the necessary infrastructure is in place. 931, emission standards for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Connecticut has a long history of following California's lead when it comes to motor vehicle emissions. Recognizing the significant pollution challenges that California faces, the federal government has permitted California and California alone to create their own more stringent motor vehicle standards. And then it also allows any other state that wants to pick between the federal standards or the California standards. And Connecticut has traditionally followed California standards for light duty vehicles. This would bring us into compliance with the California standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. And again, the sort of program that Connecticut has long experience in implementing. The 6485 Connecticut Hydrogen Electric Automobile Purchase Rebate Program, that is a mouthful. It's referred to as cheaper, and that's basically the purchase incentives for electric vehicles in the state of Connecticut. We have a dedicated greenhouse gas mitigation fee on motor vehicle registrations. A portion of that fund, we're hoping at some point all of that fund, but $3 million annually from those fees are devoted to the cheaper program to help lower the cost of electric vehicle ownership. And this year, beginning in April, for the first time, there'll be additional incentives for low and moderate income purchasers, as well as a dedicated low and moderate income component for used electric vehicles as well. So trying to make the program a little bit more equitable. Also increases demand on the available funding. So we're hoping to get some more funding for the program. Some good first steps, but we are nowhere near where we need to be in terms of our uptake of electric vehicles in the state. So we just testified yesterday on this program, offering some suggestions about how to improve it. 5419, the Federal Clean Air Act fee on motor vehicle registrations. This may surprise a lot of you, but sometimes when the state passes a dedicated fee to fund a particular program, at some point, sometimes much later, sometimes the next year, they decide they need that is on motor vehicle registrations is actually dedicated to funding clean air programs. I know, pretty radical concept. We testified on that in support, and also pointed out the fact that this greenhouse gas fee is also being diverted. So just for consistency's sake, it probably makes sense to apply that same principle to several of the state's dedicated funds. And that is a bill that has bipartisan support. We'll see if it gets majority support as it moves through the process, but certainly a sound principle. And then finally, SB 127 for transportation is really the direct sales bill. So it would basically allow Tesla and the other EV manufacturers like Rivian, who want to do business in the state of Connecticut, to actually set up shop here. Interestingly, this bill just had a hearing a couple weeks ago. I think it was maybe the 19th. News just broke about Volvo's plans to go 100% electric by 2030, and their intention is to utilize a complete online sales model, completely bypassing the dealerships. So I think that's indicative of sort of the headwinds that some of the other EV manufacturers are facing, and as they think about innovative ways to bring their products to consumers, you see this sort of trickling to some of the traditional manufacturers as well. And then there's a couple bills that deal with the building sector. This one is also having a public hearing today in the Housing Committee. One of the problems, Connecticut has a great energy efficiency program. One of the problems with it, though, is that if you're faced with older housing stock that has health or safety barriers, maybe lead paint or mold, that really presents, the way the program is designed, an insurmountable barrier to moving forward with energy efficiency retrofits for that property. The program doesn't really have the funding to deal with that. So this bill is one attempt to address that by establishing a dedicated fund that could deal with those properties and actually address and hopefully overcome the health and safety barriers that will provide the ability to make those buildings more efficient. There's also a proposal, I haven't seen it on a public hearing schedule yet, to allow municipalities to adopt green building stretch codes as well. It's a model that Massachusetts has implemented very successfully. Again, this is one that has been kind of perennial before the General Assembly. We tend to be very conservative when it comes to our building codes, but it is one that has the support of DEEP and the administration. So hoping that it can find a little bit of traction. Okay, maybe the next slide. And those are really just sort of the top tier bills. There's a lot more going on, but as with any session, there are things that are missing. So what is the General Assembly not doing that they really should be? One of those things is really establishing meaningful accountability and enforcement for achieving the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. If you curve at the right side, we really cannot afford to be doing things in the state like permitting natural gas plants, right? That just puts us on our back heels when it comes to getting the emissions reductions that we need to. We've been promoting language in various committees that, one, would require the alignment of agency decision-making with achieving our greenhouse gas goals, which is not to say you could never take an action that would be contrary to that, but for every action, there needs to be an equal and opposite reaction. So if you're doing something that is going to increase our emissions for whatever necessary reason the agency might feel, there do need to be mitigation measures put in place as well that will keep us on track. And it would also ensure that citizens, the people that really care about how well Connecticut is doing on our carbon emissions, have the ability to file citizen suits against the administration to ensure that they're doing what the law tells them to. Connecticut is one of a handful of states that has a citizen suit provision based upon the notion that we all are stewards of our natural resources, and we all share in the responsibility to preserve those resources. So in order to preserve the air, water, and land and natural resources, we can sue, but it's unclear the relationship of that statute to the climate law, and establishing a clearer connection would get over some of the evidentiary hurdles that would otherwise need to be met. It would just be a prima facie, you have the ability to enforce this. And related to that, Senator Cohen, the chair of the Environment Committee, has raised a fossil fuel moratorium bill. That's SB 178, which would basically do exactly what it says, establish a moratorium on any new fossil fuel plants in the state of Connecticut. Although raised by the chair of the Environment Committee, it was shipped over to the Energy and Technology Committee as the Committee of Cognizance, and they really don't have a lot of interest in doing anything with that bill. So there's been a lot of public pressure being brought to bear on them to actually have a public hearing on the bill and vote on it. But it really is an uphill battle. It's great to have the legislation there. It's a great vehicle for public participation and public pressure. The way the General Assembly and the legislature works, you can never count anything out until the clock strikes 12 on the final day. So we'll see. Typically, the way all of the committees have been instructed to operate is to really limit the number of bills and concepts they raise, and then as they move forward to package and combine those bills as much as humanly possible into just a few omnibus pieces of legislation. And that's really reflective of the difficulties of getting the entire House of Representatives to vote on a bill. It's a process in the virtual age. I'll just leave it at that. Anything could be in these pieces of legislation at the end of the day. So for those of you who may have already reached out to your legislator on the fossil fuel moratorium, do not be disheartened. A steady drumbeat of pressure is really what's necessary in order to move anything in these very, very strange days at the General Assembly. And I would be remiss before we go to questions, not to note that the General Assembly is not the only game in town, right? There's a lot of great work being done at the agency level, both at DEEP as well as PURA. A lot of really great stuff happening at PURA. With respect to DEEP, we've just been through the public comment period on the 2018 Integrated Resources Plan. That tells you it's been a while gestating. I think they've actually team plan. And that really covers three main areas. One, analyzing pathways to achieve that zero carbon clean energy goal of the governor. They've considered a renewable portfolio standard for thermal resources for the building sector, but decided not to move forward with that at this time. There was a lot of debate about the role of biodiesel, what role that should play in that. And then also kind of outlining and framing what is now a regional effort to reform ISO New England, which is the regional entity that procures energy resources for the grid to ensure the reliability of and capacity of energy throughout the region. It's not very responsive to the states. It's not at all responsive to the public. So Connecticut has felt very frustrated by their interactions with ISO because the ISO rules really tip the scales in favor of natural gas generation and disfavor renewable resources bidding into that market. The other states have sort of now joined Connecticut in the call for reform across a number of measures. And part of the problem is if ISO New England isn't allowing these clean energy resources to bid into the wholesale market, that means that us here in Connecticut, the ratepayers and the state, we have to procure those resources on our own, which is a more expensive process. It's worth it, but it would be much preferable if there was sort of a level playing field at the regional level, so that we could start reforming the grid at that level as well. The TCI we talked about, so I won't mention that again. The VW settlement, we just opened the third round of funding through the VW settlement funds, which are designed for really the heavy duty vehicle segment to take polluting diesel motors off the road and replace them either with cleaner diesel engines, which is not preferable, but what the majority of the money has gone to so far, or electric vehicles. And that's really what advocates are pushing for in this round. We were told it was going to be an all electric round. That does not appear to be the case according to the rules. So in the comment period on that, there have been a lot of comments urging prioritization of electric vehicle replacement. And then finally, I think, PURA. So at some point, I'm going to have to stop saying that we have a new chairman in Marissa Gillette, but it still feels new because it's such a difference in the way that agency operates and the decisions that are coming out of PURA. It's really been a breath of fresh air. They're doing a ton of work. It's tough to keep up even when it's your full-time job. They just released their updates to the solar compensation program rules, which shocked and amazed everybody. They were not what anybody was expecting, although it's what we were advocating for and hoping. So it's really preserved the framework of the traditional net metering program, which solar customers in Connecticut and the companies are really familiar with and comfortable with, while also providing a different option for people who might want to choose that. Our shared solar program, we're through the first year solicitations, and now losing no time whatsoever, PURA is looking to revise and improve the rules for round 2, which will be bids for those solar and fuel cell projects will be out probably July moving forward. And the shared solar program is a way to ensure that the benefits of clean energy accrue to everybody. It's really focused on low and moderate income households so that they can actually receive bill credits for the clean energy generation from these facilities. And then finally, a number of grid modernization dockets. There's just a handful of them listed here. One that we've been most focused on ourselves is the zero emission vehicle docket, looking at the relationship between the necessary expansion of electric vehicles in the state, how that can actually enhance our grid infrastructure, some innovative conversations about using them for demand response electric school buses is a great battery resource during the summer to help with demand response programs. And Save the Sound is actually currently working with the Rocky Mountain Institute in the early stages of a program to identify and design electrified transportation solutions, specifically for low and moderate income households in the state of Connecticut. So excited about that work. And I think that is my super lengthy and verbose presentation, and I haven't been able to keep up with the chats, but I saw that it looked pretty busy, so there are probably a lot of questions waiting for me.
There certainly are.
I don't know, should I just go through them, or do you want to moderate them?
I can read them out loud so that you don't have to scroll through the list. So I'm going to go back to the beginning.
Nobody has to start from.
To the question about SB 882. It's 100% carbon-free supplied to customers, but what about generation, and specifically relating to Killingly and Middletown?
Yes, well, that is the problem with the legislation. You know, not even so much, I think, you know, Killingly and Middletown is, but, you know, what the commissioner, you know, they're not trying to hide the ball. They've been pretty upfront about the fact that, you know, they do foresee our trash to energy facilities being necessary and continuing for you know, for the foreseeable future. You know, these are facilities which, you know, are unfortunately being promoted through the RPS. You know, this is a sign of the age of the RPS program, I think, is, you know, I don't think anybody would have suggested including an RPS category for trash to energy today. But it does underscore sort of the interrelation of a lot of the issues that Connecticut and the administration is struggling with, right? So, you know, the trash to energy facilities are really a solid waste management solution, which has really terrible air quality and environmental justice outcomes. So, you know, we need to, yes, one, be continuing the pressure to sort of expand, I guess, the ambition of our goals by, you know, clearly articulating a zero carbon generation as well as supply goal for our electricity sector. But at the same time, you know, we need to be identifying and providing solutions for some of the other issues like solid waste in the state of Connecticut. But yeah, you're absolutely right to flag that. That is one of the big problems that folks have with that legislation as written. I'm
actually going to jump a little since you brought up solid waste. So is anything being done to improve waste stream management, replace the Hartford trash plant, improve recycling, or expanding deposits?
So yes, and this is not an area that I'm an expert in, so I will quickly get in over my head, but I'll share what I can. My understanding is that the Hartford plant, its days are numbered. I know sometimes the reporting is confusing about that, and it does not seem like it's the case, but yeah, from the perspective of the administration, and I think from the perspective of the plant operator itself, you know, its days are numbered and it will not be renewed. I don't have the exact date on the top of my head. You know, I know DEEP is very interested in improving sort of our waste stream programs, particularly, you know, curbside recycling and, you know, getting organics out of the waste stream. It's been difficult with, you know, the municipalities have not necessarily been eager to participate in, you know, pay as you throw or other programs that might help to limit the amount of trash we're generating. But there is a new process, and I will not recall what all of the letters stand for, but CCCSM, I think, where DEEP is participating with quite a few municipalities to help identify solutions to the solid waste problem. So there is a formal ongoing process, which we are only peripherally involved in. And then, yes, you know, every year there are enhanced recycling and bottle deposit bills. This year is no different. But, you know, again, they face a lot of a lot of headwinds from the industry. So, making some incremental progress, but there are some really, common sense solutions there, which, unfortunately have just not seemed to get much traction.
Mhm. A question about resiliency. Where do resiliency approaches for clean energy fit into any of the legislation or state clean energy plans going forward?
Yeah, so resiliency is critical. I think here in Connecticut we've experienced it. They're certainly experiencing that in Texas right now. I think part of the problem, right, is that a lot of the people that are in charge of these systems think in terms of grid scales rather than neighborhood or even individual building scales. So, was heartened to see that over the special session last summer, there was a modest expansion of the amount of resources available for investment in microgrids. So that's certainly one approach to improving the resilience of our electricity system. Personally, I was a little disappointed, or a lot disappointed, in the fact that the Integrated Resources Plan didn't spend a lot of time talking about, distributed energy resources, your rooftop solar resources, expanded roles for battery storage. All of these things that allow you to maintain, or your neighbors to maintain, operating when a line goes down, somewhere far away, are critical. And I think that resilience question is one that's really going to need to be grappled with as we start building out our offshore wind resources as well. There's a couple models, with every offshore wind installation sort of being its standalone project with the lines running to shore to connect into the grid, or possibly the development of an offshore grid network where individual projects could sort of tap into that central system and you don't need to run as many individual lines. Clearly, if that approach is taken, there needs to be some attention paid to, how it operates resiliently. How do we ensure that if one connection goes out, all of those resources are offline?
Sure, for sure. I'm going to go back to SB 82 because we have a lot of questions about that bill. So it seems to say that greenhouse gases created for electricity shipped out of Connecticut don't count against our efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. Can we just ignore this?
Well, I guess I don't understand what you mean by can we just ignore this? So there would be no, Connecticut has some control over siting and permitting, right? So the fact that the legislation doesn't prohibit something does not necessarily mean that the decision makers have to approve it. So if that's what you mean by ignore it, then yes, that does not dictate the future. But at the same time, it doesn't dictate the future, right? So there's no mandatory limit that you're then subject to. So it sort of leaves the decision makers in the same position, frankly, as they are today, with respect to those generation and export resources. And that's one of the elements that we're hoping some of this accountability language would address. If in even broader terms, like, right. So if we added that language to 882, that would be great, but that would only apply to sort of the narrow resources that are contemplated there, as opposed to statewide agency decision making. But it doesn't mean we have to build more natural gas plants, particularly if we reform the ISO structure. But I wouldn't say that it is necessarily unlikely unless some things align, right? Because natural gas plants are still going to be the low bidders into that regional system. So there's going to be pressure to permit them.
Okay. Another 882 question. So energy labeling is bundled with the problematic aspects of 882. And the fear is that the home energy labeling will not move forward if the generation and supply problem is not resolved. And can you basically comment on that issue?
So that is an interesting perspective. I would actually take, and could well be valid. I would actually, my opinion would actually be the opposite of that. If these things are bundled, the anchor on that bill is likely to be the home labeling rather than the 100% by 2040 target. Although I have just recently seen, it looks like the real estate industry has sort of started to come around on that. Yeah, but typically that home energy labeling has met with some opposition. So I wouldn't necessarily say that if that were a standalone bill, it would be smooth sailing moving forward.
Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna pop to net metering. So updating net metering is great, but does that mean that there's no more incentives for residential solar, and will that reduce interest?
So that was the fear, but the program that came out of PURA actually preserves the current structure. If you're happy with the way the incentive structure works now, that will be available for the time being. And if you're not, so maybe get into it. So traditional net metering, right? You can use the electricity that your energy system is producing for your own energy needs. And to the extent that there are fluctuations between what you're producing and what you're pulling off of the grid at the end of the netting period, there's sort of a true up, right? So you figure out, what did you use during that period? How much did you generate during that period? And then you're compensated for excess, or your bill represents the deficit. So that continues. There's also a second option, sort of called the buy all sell all, where basically you become a resource for the grid. So the utility is buying all of the power that you generate, quote unquote, and you are buying all of the power that you consume from the utility. The concern there was that sort of the difference between what the utilities are paying you for your energy and what you're paying them would be unattractive to consumers. And our fear was that would be the only option for consumers. As the program currently stands, though, the utilities will be buying your power at the retail rate. So the same rate you're purchasing it. So.
Great. I'm going to bounce to renewables. So what do you see as the pros and cons of the distribution companies getting into renewables?
I mean, so I guess my only caution there would be that, we don't want them displacing the third party solar companies, right, who are going to be an essential part of our clean energy economy moving forward. As it stands now, it's pretty limited in scope. But I think we just want to make sure, from my perspective, that we're not completely displacing the market for the companies that have the expertise and the history of delivering these resources. Regardless of how you feel about sort of deregulation and getting the utilities out of generation altogether, I mean, that's a system we have in Connecticut. So this is sort of a step back to utility ownership, and sort of need to see where that lands. I don't necessarily have an opinion on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for the utilities to own generation, but the fact of the matter is that in Connecticut, a decision was made that to divest generation resources from the utilities. And it seems like they kind of have their hands full sometimes just doing what their core mission is. So I think also maybe expanding their mission may be a little bit problematic. I assume the hope is, right, that they can deliver those resources cheaper, but I guess it remains to be seen.
can you provide some details on Pura's solar compensation program? On the updates to it?
Yes, so I think we sort of covered them in broad strokes. And this would only apply, sorry, trying to get back here, to the residential side. Essentially, as I read it, they were told to sort of review and revise the net metering program, and essentially, not punted, because that seems dismissive. Looked at the data, took testimony, and they decided that actually the net metering program kind of works, right? So some of the concerns, and maybe defining it and what they didn't do will help illuminate it. Some of the concerns and some of what the utilities were really looking for, in addition to just scrapping net metering altogether and going to sort of a buy all, sell all system, which you would basically be selling your power at the wholesale rate and purchasing all of your power at the retail rate, which it makes very little economic sense if you're investing in solar panels. With the net metering program, the concern was that they would be able to move forward with a so-called instantaneous netting period. So it means that you're not netting it over your regular monthly billing cycle, but it's done in sort of a real time, done in real time through the use of smart meters. From an expansion of the solar capacity in Connecticut, that is just a really hard sell for consumers, right? Because you have no idea what your energy use is going to be from minute to minute, right? So very difficult to sort of make those informed decisions about whether an investment in a rooftop solar system actually makes sense for you. How is it going to operate? How much is it going to offset your energy usage? Good luck trying to figure that out. But that's not what they did. So the net metering rules do use a monthly netting period, which really allows you to figure out your average monthly loads, what your needed capacity is for the solar system, and then proceed accordingly. And there's also the ability, I think annually, I'd have to go back and check the details, to actually receive a cash out as well. So at the end of all those monthly periods, if you're still have excess capacity that you've generated, utilities will actually write you a check.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. So we have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to close with a pretty broad question, but I think a really good question to end this whole discussion with. What should we be asking our representatives and senators to do at this point?
Maybe you can bring up the what's missing slide. So I think those are really concepts that they need to be hearing about. And they're tough lifts for sure, right? The fossil fuel moratorium, the Committee of Cognizance really has little interest in pursuing that. So if folks are interested in that, making your voice heard and applying pressure is really the only way that is going to happen. And likewise, in terms of the accountability and enforceability pieces, I think when and if you are communicating with your legislators, raising these concepts and underscoring your concerns and saying, we love the fact that Connecticut has adopted these climate goals, but what does it really mean when we continue to permit and propose building new fossil fuel plants, in the state of Connecticut? That doesn't really seem to align with what the law says. And this would actually provide an opportunity to force alignment between the decision making and the state laws.
Well, great. And I want to thank you, Charles, for a wonderful presentation, and thank everybody who joined us today and is really engaged with combating climate change in our state. So thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you.